Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ruth Langer and I am the interim director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. And so it is my privilege and my honor to be welcoming all of you today to what has become an annual Corcoran Chair Conference, sponsored and planned by the holder of the Corcoran Visiting Chair in Jewish Christian Relations here with us at Boston College. With us today is not only the current holder of the Corcoran Chair, Dr. Jesper Svartvik, but also the Associate Director of our center, Camille Markey, and a graduate assistant who's been giving us invaluable help, particularly with our online presentation of materials, Yujia Sam Jai. This is a Zoom meeting in the old-fashioned sense, more or less, so I ask everybody who is not currently speaking to please mute themselves, and that way we can ensure that the program goes as smoothly as possible. Jesper is currently the 10th holder of the Corcoran Visiting Chair, which was part of the inaugural gift, founding gift, an endowment of our center. This is an opportunity for us to bring a senior scholar who works in Jewish Christian relations to Boston College for a year, or in several cases, it's been 2 years. And this is actually Jesper's second year with us, his first year actually in residence in Boston, thanks to the pandemic. I will not speak much to the conference title right now, because that is also what Jesper is going to be speaking to in his opening talk this afternoon. But I should just name that this idea of treasures old and new is a question of saying, what is it that we are bringing to the world of Jewish Christian relations in this era of renewed dialogue? What is it that we can bring from the traditions of various churches? So sessions 2 and 3 of this conference are going to be quite specifically from the perspective of specific Christian churches, today Catholic and Orthodox, and then next week Lutheran and Calvinist. And then a final closing session next week on the way forward, given this heritage that we're bringing, these treasures that we're bringing to the contemporary dialogue. Today's session is entirely on Zoom, as you can probably tell by looking at my background, which is not a conference room at Boston College. But next week, the meeting will be hybrid. So the speakers will be presenting in person at Boston College, and many of you are registered to be joining us on Zoom. But any of you who would like to join us in person, please contact Camille Markey to let her know, but we would be very glad to have as many warm bodies as seems appropriate and good and good in the room, so that we can have a live conversation as well. Today, because we are entirely remote, entirely virtual, all questions will be asked over Zoom. And I ask that you, when you have a question, you can place it in the chat, and the session's chair will be keeping an eye on the chat in order to relay the questions to the speakers. The other thing I should name is that there will be a break between today's 2 sessions. We will keep Zoom open during the break, and will, as needed, invite you to join together and have a chance to chat informally with each other, but also we'll have a breakout room or 2 or 3 available for people who would like to have smaller conversations with the speakers or with each other. So that is also going to be a possibility. So with that, let me turn the program over to John Stendahl, who is the chair for the first session today, and we can get going. Thank you.
Yes. It's good to be with you all virtually, and I can't help but think also that being here is virtuous. Although I have to honor my Lutheran heritage and say when we perceive virtue in what we do, it is something to make us careful lest we be too complacent or self-assured. But here we are for this Treasures New and Old. When I saw the title for this, I remembered my father, Christer Stendahl, the scholar and ecumenist churchman, talking about this passage with his own pleasure and calling attention to something that I know that Jesper will mention as well. The word order. It doesn't say, as one might expect, treasures old and new. It's the passage in the Gospel of Matthew has Jesus referring to treasures new and old. And my father took delight in that the new was not kind of the afterthought or the interpretation merely of the old, but that it was given a pride of place. And he often, along those lines, would quote the rabbinic saying, now is the time to do a new thing for the Lord. In introducing Jesper Svartvik, I think so much of the way in which he has in his career honored the legacy of my father, Christer Stendahl, honored it not only by biblical and theological scholarship shaped by that same hermeneutical wisdom and insight, but also his shared concern about the ethical harm or good, in a sense, the public health issues, as it were, particularly in relation to those who are considered other in our religious traditions. Jesper is, as said, currently the Corcoran visiting chair here at BC, and he has authored 12 books from his doctoral thesis on the problematic passages at the beginning of chapter 7 in Mark and Mission, entitled, and then most recently, his Reconstruction and Transformation, Reconsidering Christian Theologies of the Cross. In addition to that, he has done such marvelous work as co-editor of important works, most recently, the Partners in Hope dialogue entitled Enabling Dialogue About the Land, a resource book for Jews and Christians. So I'm delighted to be introducing him here. I also am very much looking forward to hearing from Judith Banki, whom I have long admired from afar, and I will give a little bit more information about her as her time comes. So I turn this over to Jesper. Welcome.
Thank you. There are 5 speeches in the Gospel of Matthew, as there are 5 books in the Torah. Hence, the very structure of this gospel illustrates the topic for today's and next Sunday's conference here at Boston College, Treasures New and Old. I believe Matthew structured his material carefully, so that the first speech begins with a series of Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and the last one with denouncements of hypocrites, but woe to you. The second speech is addressed to those who go out. It says, these 12 apostles Jesus sent out. And the fourth speech is directed to the insiders, who should become humble like children, people who think of God as a shepherd who searches for lost sheep that had gone astray, and the members of a community requested to forgive not 7, but 77 times. Hence, the first and the last speeches contain beatitudes and denouncement. The second and the fourth deal with reaching out and reaching in. And in the middle, the very center of the entire gospel, we have the third speech, which contains a series of parables, ending with the title for these opening remarks, chapter 13, verse 52. Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of God is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. This is the ending of the middle speech in Matthew, the center of his gospel. Elsewhere in Matthew, indeed in most of the New Testament, and certainly in Christian teaching and preaching, scribes are condemned, notoriously in Matthew's 23rd chapter, but not here. And this may serve as a reminder that the rationale for the critique of the scribes and the Pharisees, so manifest in Matthew's gospel, is not their Jewishness, but that they do not agree with Matthew. They are scribes, all right, but not Matthean scribes, right? The Matthean message is, my Judaism is better than your Judaism. And to me, it's quite clearly an inner Jewish perspective that we encounter in this gospel. Quote, if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? End of quote. So the wording in the Lucan parallel is quite striking, where it says, even sinners do the same. So for Luke, Gentiles are not outsiders, but for Matthew, they are. As John Stendahl said, the order of the two words new and old in this verse is interesting. It doesn't say first old and then new, as one may suspect, implying that new is not only better than old, but also that it replaces what is old. But it says new and old. And these observations give us cause for a few reflections in these opening remarks on the two keywords in Jewish-Christian relations. The text in Greek in the Christian Bible, apart from the addition to the Hebrew scriptures known as the Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical writings, go by the name the New Testament, since Jerome. How then are we to understand the relationship between, on the one hand, Christian faith, and on the other hand, the covenant of God with the Jewish people? In what way is the New Testament new? And what do we mean by new? Is new always better than old? Does new always replace what is old? An important first aspect is that the words new and old are not used consistently in the Bible. The commandment of love is described in the Gospel of John as new, even though it already exists, of course, in what Christians call the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:18. And in the first epistle of John, written by someone who belongs to the same theological school as the author of the Gospel of John, if not written by one and the same person, it is pointed out that the commandment of love is not new at all, but it's an old commandment. Because in that gospel, it seems that the theological opponents have launched a new doctrine, and that's the reason why the word old is a guarantee for good theology. Unfortunately, many Christians have simplistically assumed that their way of talking about old and new means that the former covenant would be obsolete. It's true that the terms Old Testament, New Testament, and behind them the Latin term testamentum easily brings to mind an Old Testament that's no longer legally valid because it has been replaced by New Testament, as a newer will replaces and makes void all older wills. But is the Christian master story then a narrative about a capricious Old Testament deity who at his deathbed makes a radical change in his will, disinheriting his children in order to let the inheritance go to others who are hastily made his heirs? Is that really this image? Is it really that image of God that Christians want to convey? The message in the Hebrew Bible is that the commandments have been given to the people of the covenant so that they may live through them, v'chai b'hem. And that Johannine Jesus proclaims that he has come for people to have life and life in abundance. Passover for Jews, Easter for Christians are future-oriented stories about hope in difficult times, leaving slavery and despair behind. They are not stories about inheritance disputes. And in this context, how should we then understand the words old and new and old? It's quite obvious that the word new has played an important role in Christian theology. not least because of the words of institution at Eucharistic services that speak about the new covenant. The oldest evidence for this expression is found in Paul and the Synoptic tradition. But when discussing these issues, we should remember that it's probably only Paul and Luke that use the phrase the new covenant, in Greek hekaine diatheke. In Matthew and Mark, it says instead the covenant blood, to haimates diathekes. The fact that the variant new appears in some manuscripts of Matthew and Mark is probably due to the fact that the Lucan text has influenced them, not the other way around. As Bruce Metzger writes, if it had been present originally, there is no good reason why anyone would have deleted it. And to me, this is an indication that the Eucharist was regularly celebrated in the Matthean and Markan communities without being perceived as a sign of a new covenant. So the fact that the oldest text, the oldest context of the Eucharist most likely is the Jewish Passover meal, serves as a reminder of the fundamental role that the Exodus motif plays in both Jewish and Christian theology. In the Hebrew Bible, from slavery to freedom, and in the New Testament, through death to life. So Judaism is not just a background that Christians occasionally may become acquainted with before quickly returning to the Christian world. Almost everything in these two biblical traditions flows out of the Exodus motif. As many of you know, the Hebrew word for slavery for Pharaoh and for worshiping God is one and the same in Hebrew, avodah. And there is in Exodus a fundamental dialectic between, on the one hand, the destructive service as slaves to Pharaoh, and on the other hand, the possibility of worshiping the God of Israel in the desert in freedom, which is a truly liberating service. And to understand the deep connection between Judaism and Christianity, we need to realize that it does not suffice to make a short study visit in order to get acquainted with the Jewish roots or the Jewish background, and then light-mindedly and thoughtlessly ascertain that Christianity in relation to these roots and this background is new. Of course, the word new also occurs in the Jewish tradition. In the morning prayer, Shacharit, we find a phrase that is relevant to our discussion. God is described as and approached as HaMechadesh betuvu bechol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit, the one who in goodness renews the works of creation each and every day. And the first word, HaMechadesh, which means the renewer or the one who renews, is related to Chadash, meaning new. And the theological idea is that God creates and God recreates the world in every single moment. It is a matter of creatio continua. It's interesting to note that this prayer is repeated in less than a minute in the liturgy, and this repetition underlines the theology of renewal. Over and over again, God renews creation without undermining the covenant. The God of Israel and the Israel of God keep covenanting, and the renewal in nature and in people only underline this. It is a matter of underlining, not undermining. The Hebrew adjective chadash also has to do with the noun chidush that John Stendahl referred to. It refers to a reinterpretation of a text, not at the expense of God's everlasting covenantal faithfulness, but as a manifestation of it. And that brings us to the theological concept, covenant. Behind the English word testament, there is the Latin word testamentum. And behind Jerome's testamentum, we find the Greek diatheke, the word that the translators of the Septuagint chose. And behind diatheke, we have the Hebrew Bible's berit. So what then do berit and diatheke mean? How are we to translate them into our vernacular languages today? This is, of course, a complex issue that it takes time to discuss and analyze, and there is always a risk of oversimplifications of such a vast topic. But my impression is that there are three main interpretations in Christian theology. The first one about replacement, that the new will necessarily replaces the old will. The new will replaces the old will. This is, of course, a supersessionist reading of the biblical text. In short, Christians replace Jews. The old heirs, the Jews, do not inherit anything because only the new will is valid. Hence, a core message of a Christian's belief, according to this first line of thoughts, is that Christianity necessarily disinherits Judaism, and that it's central and an indispensable part of Christian teaching that Jews are theologically dispossessed. As you all know, this interpretation has been both influential among Christians and detrimental to Jews in history. But to me, it also seems quite clear that it is anachronistic. It's anachronistic to connect Old to Judaism and New to Christianity when interpreting the New Testament, because at that time, in the 1st century CE, when the texts were written down, they were not perceived as two distinct and different religious traditions. Hence, we need to explore other options. The second one I call difference. The New Testament is different from the Old Covenant. The New Testament is different from the Old Covenant, because in the New Testament, we read about Jesus who, especially at the Last Supper, is talking about his own death. When he dies, his heirs inherit the treasure. Hence, diatheke in the New Testament is different from Brit in the Hebrew Bible, which is a promise about the future, because Jesus's testament is the last will of someone who knows that he's about to die. This is clearly the perspective also in the Johannine farewell discourse, in which Jesus hands over the Parakletos, the helper, to the disciples, who is as near and dear to them as their master. Since diatheke refers to the wish and will of Jesus who is about to die, strictly speaking, diatheke is not the Greek synonym of Brit, although the translators of the Septuagint saw it that way. Martin Luther, for example, states, quote, "He who stays alive makes a covenant, he who is about to die makes a testament," end of quote. So the focus in this second line of thought is the death of Jesus. Not necessarily that the old covenant became invalid or the Jewish people allegedly theologically ceased to exist. This second interpretation can, of course, be as triumphalistic as the previous one, but I believe that it need not be. But Christians have far more often than not been triumphalistic vis-à-vis the Jewish tradition. However, one could emphasize that diatheke in the New Testament primarily has to do with the death of Jesus and the heritage that he hands over to his disciples. And that Brit and diatheke, therefore, are different in kind, not in quality. And as far as I know, Luther in general used the German word Bund, meaning covenant, when translating the Hebrew word Brit, and when translating the Greek word diatheke, he generally used the word testaments, meaning will. The Johannine Jesus gives us a brief job description of a thief. In 10:10 it says, "He comes only to steal and kill and destroy." And I cannot but think of the supersessionist agenda when I hear this description, since supersessionists take the scriptures of another faith community. It's not a matter of sharing, but of stealing. But Jesus says, "I have come to give life and life in abundance." And that takes me to the third line of thought, the third interpretation, not replacement, not difference, but one of extension, that God extends covenantal grace to the Gentiles too. That God extends covenantal grace to the Gentiles. In the Pauline epistles, the oldest text in the Christian tradition, the apostle argues that now, at the end of time, the God of Israel is reaching out also to the Gentiles, and in that sense, it is a new covenant in the New Testament. That God is gracious when covenanting with the Jewish people and offering them a Brit Olam, an eternal covenant. And God is gracious also when covenanting with the Gentiles. It is a matter of life for Israel and life in abundance for the nations. And since Paul sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles specifically, this is what he emphasizes in his teaching and preaching, that his message is about Gentile inclusion, not Jewish exclusion. Hence, Israel remains Israel, and the inclusion of the Gentiles is a foretaste of the world to come. As he writes in Galatians 6:16, quote, "It is a new creation. And for those Gentiles who will follow this rule, peace be upon them and mercy, and also upon the Israel of God." I would like to say a few words about the speakers at this conference. First, we have the privilege to listen to Judith Hershcopf Banki, an eyewitness from the Second Vatican Council, the author of the influential 1961 report, The Image of the Jews in Catholic Teaching. And as someone said, Judy Banki has had a front row seat for the unfolding of modern Jewish Catholic dialogue during the Vatican II Council and is one of its leading voices in the more than 5 decades since. Her paper will be followed by 4 speakers that present for us the hidden treasures in 4 Christian traditions. Matthew Tapi will explore the Catholic tradition, Michael Azar, the Orthodox tradition. Next Sunday, we will learn from Barbara Meyer about the Lutheran tradition and from Randall Zachman about the Calvinist tradition. The reason for inviting 2 speakers of the Reformed tradition is that Luther and Lutherans on the one hand, and Calvin and Calvinists on the other hand, approach the Jewish tradition in 2 quite different ways. And we are delighted to have 2 distinguished Jewish respondents, Adam Gregerman and Amy Jill Levine. The final session, led by Mary Boyce and Peter Pettit, will directly address implementing and communicating the research of this conference. Please know that we are so delighted that all of you, moderators, speakers, and respondents, have accepted our invitation. And as always, I'm grateful for and would like to acknowledge stimulating cooperation with my colleagues at the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College, Professor Ruth Langer and Dr. Camille Markey. Jewish-Christian relations have often been interpreted with the help of the lethal tensions between Cain and Abel. Augustine famously described the Jews as Cainites. He stated that the mitzvot, the commandments, are a mark of Cain. The Jews, quote, never lost the sign of their law by which they are distinguished from all other nations and peoples, end of quote. And post-Shoah Christian theologians sometimes describe anti-Jewish Christendom as a Cain figure who has wounded Abel, who has been lying on the ground bleeding for 2,000 years, and his blood cries out to us. In most Bible translation, it says in Genesis 4:8 that Cain spoke to his brother. But the Hebrew text does not use vayodaber, and he spoke, but vayomer, and he said. But we don't know what he said. The Midrashim, of course, have numerous suggestions. Cain articulates several theologically completely incorrect statements. But the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Peshitta, simply state that Cain said, let us go into the field. The elthomen estopedion in the Septuagint. The elthomen, let us go. So when someone asks you to do that, you ought to apply the hermeneutics of suspicion. One should beware the Ides of March and the elthomen. But there is another text. There is another biblical text that also speaks about walking together into the fields. In Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, the bride says to the groom, come, my friend, let us go forth into the fields. Lecha dodi netzeh hasadeh. And she describes all the precious fruits that are there. The mandrakes give forth fragrance, and at our doors are all choice of precious fruits, new and old, that I have treasured up for you, O my friend. Chadashim gam yeshanim dodi tzafanti lach. So, my friends at this conference, let's go into the field and explore all that is so precious to us. Let the treasure hunt begin. And I now hand over the microphone to John Stendahl, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Jesper. I am honored now to introduce Judy Banki. She is someone whom I have long admired from afar, as I said earlier, not least for the way in which she has, through decades, articulately and clearly addressed dialogue partners and leaders in the Roman Catholic community and in other Christian churches. Her work has, and her witness has been a blessing. She is an internationally acknowledged writer and lecturer whose writings have appeared in a variety of Jewish and Christian journals, including a prize-winning article in Commonweal, and is the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Seton Hall, the Nostra Aetate Award from the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Studies and the Shevet Achim Award from the CCJR. At 94 years of age, she is still active in the field. As we think about what is old and what is new, she is one who bears witness to that novum represented by Nostra Aetate, and she contributed to the thinking and the response and the movement of the heart that it involved. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Judy today. Judy, as they say, take it away.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank everybody. You know, there's an astonishing collection of talent that's been assembled for this two-day conference. And I think most will be focusing on where we are in terms of their own religious tradition and where we should be going. And my job, as I understand it, is to talk about how we got to where we are. And of course, that requires looking at the Second Vatican Council, which really was a watershed event in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, and maybe even my modest role in it. And I want to begin by quoting another eyewitness, someone much closer to the daily conflicts and crises within the halls of Vatican II than I was. And that was Father Tom Stransky, who served as a young priest in the Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity during the Vatican Council, which is where the so-called Jewish portfolio was housed. That's very interesting. The Jewish portfolio was housed not in the Secretariat for Dialogue with Non-Christian Religions, but in the Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity, which of course tells its own story and is part of both the problem and the solution that we'll be talking about. But anyway, Tom Stransky wrote, quote, "It is impossible to understand modern Catholicism, indeed modern Protestantism and Eastern Orthodoxy, without taking into account Vatican II." I would add that is ditto, that's true for the contemporary Jewish community and the broad field of Jewish relations, Jewish-Christian relations. And he goes on to note that these monumental changes took place before most of today's Catholics and Protestants were born. You know, that's a shocker to me because I've been around a long time, but I realize that it's true. And he wrote, "The documents stand by themselves without a history." In his words, quote, "The texts outlive the contexts." So today, almost 60 years after the council's deliberations, I hope to recall some of the contexts. Like Father Stransky, I am a child of the Second Vatican Council. That is, I cut my teeth in the field of Jewish-Christian relations as part of a relatively small group of Jewish activists who mounted an initiative on behalf of an authoritative statement on Jews and Judaism to be adopted at the council, a statement that would condemn anti-Semitism, repudiate the fairly widespread deicide, God-killing charge against the Jewish people, correct teachings of contempt about Jews and Judaism, acknowledge that Judaism did not end with the emergence of Christianity, but continued to develop as a living faith, and inaugurate an ongoing dialogue between the church and the Jewish community. And we further hope that these policies would be implemented through the establishment of some permanent structure within the church. In other words, an address and a phone number. Now, from this side of Nostra Aetate, it looks like a done deal. It was passed by an overwhelming majority, but believe me, it was a cliffhanger. And some more background. when John the 23rd was elected to the papacy in 1958, he was an old man, he was not in great health, and he was expected just to be an interim pope after Pius XII, and to hold the church together till a younger and more vigorous pope could be chosen. But he surprised everybody by announcing the summoning of an ecumenical council. At that time, we were approached by a French Catholic author and scholar, Madame Claire Huchet Bishop, who is an ardent devotee of the work of Jules Isaac, and it was she who pressed for the publication of his books in the United States, and thus indirectly for familiarity with the expression, the teaching of contempt, on the North American continent. She urged us in the Interreligious Affairs Department to become involved insofar as possible in the forthcoming council, to engage in a vigorous initiative for the repudiation, quote, at the highest level of the church, end quote, of that anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic tradition of teaching and preaching, whereby Jews had been segregated, degraded, charged with wicked crimes, and valued only as potential converts. Ecumenical councils are few and far between, she said. I think the former one was 1875, and that was a very conservative council that it issued the doctrine of papal infallibility and discharged as a crazy idea the idea of religious liberty. And another historic event at the time added urgency to that goal, because while the preparatory commissions for the council were going about their work, the nightmarish details of the Nazi genocide against the Jews were being vividly recalled by the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. A generation after the Shoah, some people learned for the first time that half the Jews of Europe, 1/3 of the Jewish people in the entire world, had died in that Holocaust, most of them deliberately and cruelly murdered. Ancient communities of learning and piety vanished overnight, and all with the deliberate goal of wiping this people from the face of the earth and erasing from memory its culture, its language, and its religious legacy. The moral questions posed by the Eichmann trial were not lost on religious spokesmen. Some of them pointed to the need to root out the sources of hatred and contempt for Jews and Judaism for once and for all. It soon became known that the key figure with regard to a Jewish decree at Vatican II was Cardinal Augustin Beyer, a German Jesuit and biblical scholar, and that he and his secretariat had been entrusted by Pope John to draft a statement and to seek representative Jewish viewpoints. The way was open for communication and dialogue, and we jumped in with both feet. And as was pointed out, over a year before the opening of the council's first session, on July 31st, 1961, we submitted to Cardinal Beyer by prior agreement the first of several comprehensive memoranda. It was titled The Image of the Jew in Catholic Teaching. It was a 32-page document which identified and illustrated slanderous interpretations, oversimplifications, unjust or inaccurate comparisons, invidious use of language, and significant omissions in American Catholic textbooks. And it cited existing Catholic sources that could serve as corrections. And I am the author of that document, and therein lies the story. When I came to the American Jewish Committee late in 1959, I was assigned the task of familiarizing myself with the findings of self-studies of Protestant and Catholic religious textbooks that had been stimulated by the American Jewish Committee. That Jews should be concerned about how Christians depicted them should not surprise anybody. Jews were convinced that a certain tradition of Christian teaching and preaching represented one of the primary sources of anti-Semitism across the centuries. Still, I should stress that these were self-studies in which the religious education materials of a particular religious community were examined by a scholar from within that community and faithful to its values and visions. The Catholic studies were carried out at St. Louis University, a Jesuit institution. There were 3 teaching nuns who carried out 3 different studies, one of social studies materials, one of literature materials, but the pay dirt, of course, was in the religion and church history textbooks. And they were examined by Sister Rose Thiering, a Dominican nun from Racine, Wisconsin. Incidentally, I should add that transformed by the implications of her own research, Sister Thiering became an important educator in the field, serving with Monsignor John Osterreicher at the Center for Judeo-Christian Studies at Seton Hall University. She was also a lively activist on behalf of Israel, and she was my friend. When I first began reading the raw data from the Protestant and Catholic textbooks, I was astonished both at the degree of hostility to Jews and Judaism and at the extent of brute libel I found in many of the excerpts. I'm going to recall some of these statements, just not to embarrass anyone, but to remind us of the dimensions of the problems we uncovered. And here are some quotations from several Catholic textbooks that were in use at the time. Quote, "His prophecy was partially fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem and more fully in the rejection by God of the chosen people." Number 2, quote, "Christ, by his miracles and preaching, tried to conquer the obstinacy of the Jews and bring them to repentance. The Jews, on the contrary, by the bad influence of their hypocrisy and pride, hindered the spread of the knowledge of God among other nations," unquote. I wonder if this lesson writer recalled Matthew's accusation that a Pharisee would cross land and sea to make one disciple. For Israel's mission was and remains to spread the knowledge of one God among the nations, not to make everybody Jewish, but to have everyone affirm one God, the Creator and Redeemer. And third, perhaps most poisonous, quote, "The Jews as a nation refused to accept Christ, and since his time, they have been wanderers on the earth without a temple or a sacrifice and without the Messiah," end quote. And I was particularly struck by this passage because it was so similar to a Protestant lesson. Quote, "Israel rejected their Messiah when he came, and because of their failure, they withered away. This has been Israel's condition as a nation for centuries. She has been dried up with no national symbols, such as a land, a king, a flag." Now, both of these statements were published years after the emergence of the modern state of Israel. The Protestant textbook comment 14 years later. They are striking instances of history, of reality trumped by theology. And if the theological proposition is that Jews' loss of national sovereignty, their dispersion, and subsequent suffering and persecution are providential punishment for the crime of killing or rejecting Jesus, then clearly the state of Israel can have no validity. It contradicts the theological conviction of permanent Jewish dispersion. Therefore, by definition, Israel is a spiritual impostor. Now, whether this theological presupposition translates into political judgments on Israel's behavior is not part of our subject today. It's a question worthy of another conference, and I'd like a place at the table at that one if I'm still with us. Now, what struck me about the examples I have cited was the vehemence, the intensity with which any sense of continuing mission for Judaism, any meaningful witness for the Jewish people, except witnessing to the superior truth of Christianity, any validity in Jewish terms for the recreation of a Jewish commonwealth in Israel were dismissed a priori. And I believe this qualifies as the teaching of contempt. The document which was submitted to Cardinal Bea incorporated such examples, which were unearthed in Sister Rosa's research. But the organization, the arguments, the call for the forthcoming council to repudiate such teachings, they were my own. I was not bound by the rules and regulations that constrained her, for she could not evaluate it as negative any statement about Jews and Judaism, no matter how disparaging, that was considered church doctrine at the time. And then on November 17, 1961, a second memorandum, Anti-Jewish Elements of Catholic Liturgy, was submitted to Cardinal Bea. It acknowledged the recent deletion of problematic passages in the liturgy, but it noted that the concept of Jews as deicides still figured in some liturgical passages, in popular and scholarly commentaries on the liturgy and on homiletic literature. In December 1961, Rabbi Mark Tanenbaum, who was head of the Interreligious Department at the American Jewish Committee, and with whom I worked for some 25 years, he arranged for Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel to meet with Cardinal Bea in Rome. And Heschel was invited to submit suggestions for positive council action to improve Jewish-Christian relations. In May 1962, he followed up with a memorandum recommending a number of specific actions: forthright rejection of the deicide charge, recognition of Jews as Jews rather than as potential converts, and promotion of scholarly and civic cooperation, and the creation of church agencies to help overcome religious prejudice. There was some resistance to fellow Jews to these initiatives. What else is new? There were naysayers who claimed that the church was by its very nature anti-Semitic, and that efforts to change it were futile and demeaning. One rabbi told me, Esau will always hate Jacob. Others argued that anti-Semitism was a Christian problem, let the Christians solve it. Perhaps the most common objection was, quote, they're only interested in converting us. But resistance within the Jewish community was nothing compared to the vehemence and hostility that the so-called Jewish Declaration engendered, both inside and outside the deliberations of the Vatican Council. And the objections to any positive statement about Jews and Judaism came from two sources: theological reactionaries and Arab governments and religious leaders. The Arab opposition to any statement expressing esteem or affection for Jews, suggesting a special relationship between Christianity and the Jewish people, deploring specific acts of persecution against Jews, and removing a theological basis of anti-Semitism. That opposition was politically motivated, but Christian theological categories were enlisted in the campaign, which was carried out at the highest political and diplomatic levels. Indeed, the campaign included several diplomatic démarches to the Holy See and threats of reprisals against Christian minorities in Arab lands. In addition to the Arab initiatives, there was a sustained campaign against the so-called Jewish Declaration on doctrinal grounds by conservative elements within the church who believed that Jews as a people did indeed bear collective responsibility as deicides, and that their suffering across the ages was proof of providential punishment. I assume they did not take into mind the fact that the church was responsible for a lot of that suffering across the ages. Now, representatives of this position may have constituted only a small minority within the council, but they had access to extraordinary channels of distribution. Thus, a few days before the conclusion of the second council session, every prelate found in his mailbox a privately printed 900-page volume, The Plot Against the Church, Il Complotto contra la Chiesa, filled with the most primitive anti-Semitism and described by George Higgins as a sickening diatribe against the Jews. It charged that there was a Jewish fifth column among the Catholic clergy plotting against the church, and it justified Hitler's acts against the Jews. During the second session, another anti-Semitic publication was privately distributed to the council fathers that was named The Jews and the Council in the Light of Scripture and Tradition, translated from the Italian title. It cited Catholic sources supporting the God-killing charge against the Jews and proclaimed that Jews could only wipe out the curse upon them by converting to Christianity, and insisted that efforts to change the traditional view were the result of a conspiracy in the council by Jews and Freemasons working on behalf of communism. And by the way, that document, our homegrown American anti-Semite Gerald K. Smith offered to translate it into English and distribute it in the United States. Now, revisiting the paranoia of the ultra-right and the fierce opposition of the Arab world, it is perhaps remarkable that any positive statement made it through the gamut at all. But it was almost scuttled, and its fate was tied to a roller coaster for the duration of the council. We were told that it would be introduced into the second session of the council. It was not. A weakened version of the statement introduced in the third session included language that seemed to imply that respect for Jews was motivated by missionary interest and contingent upon Jewish conversion. And obviously, this didn't sit well with the Jewish community. Rabbi Heschel at the time publicly stated that faced with the alternative between conversion and death, he would choose Auschwitz. And some of the Orthodox leaders said to us on the sly, you see, that's what they wanted all along. But I have to say that that also angered some major American Catholic and European Catholic leaders who raised their voices in support of a clear and forthright statement. And the American hierarchy started using its influence in the council on behalf of a statement on Jews and Judaism. So the battered and bruised Declaration on the Jews, which promulgated by Paul VI as Nostra Aetate, was adopted on the council on its final day, along with the Declaration on Religious Liberty. Both had survived determined assaults, were weakened in their final form, and were to a certain extent compromised documents. But both changed the church irretrievably and set Jews and Christians on a new path. Nostra Aetate has been addressed in a number of follow-up documents. Some have expanded and strengthened it. Some appear to have backtracked or retreated. There have been many bumps along the way, some setbacks and misunderstandings. In an American Jewish Yearbook article in 1966, I predicted that it would be implemented least where it was needed the most, and this seems to be the case. Just within the last month, a Syrian Orthodox Archbishop on Iranian television testified that the Jews killed Christ and their own prophets, and that the Nostra Aetate was a huge mistake, and that the church should never have, quote, absolved, unquote, the Jews from their crime. Of course, the church did not absolve the Jews. And I particularly want to note, sadly, that the entire arsenal of Christian anti-Judaism, particularly the blood libel, which is largely repudiated by Western contemporary church communities, has been appropriated by Islamic extremists as a political weapon. To wit, a former Jordanian member of parliament claimed in a television interview that Jews use the blood of Christian children to make matzah. And I quote, on their religious holidays, if they cannot find a Muslim to slaughter and use drops of his blood to knead the matzahs they eat, they slaughter a Christian in order to take drops of his blood and mix it into the matzahs they eat on holiday. Alas, this belief is not exceptional in the Arab Middle East. Egyptian national television broadcast a multi-segment series based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. I saw one of those segments with my own eyes. In it, the Jews capture a young Christian boy, place him in a barrel, pierce his veins, draw the blood, and the rabbi rubs his hands together and says, oh, the matzahs will taste particularly delicious this Passover. I had to say, it made me sick to my stomach. At the time, I thought it was an Egyptian production and limited to that audience. But Professor Reuben Firestone, a scholar and defender of Islam and a friend of the Muslim community, told me that the series was produced in Syria and has been distributed throughout the Muslim world, and that hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Muslims in Indonesia and Malaysia who have never met a Jew now believe this is Judaism. It has done, he said, incalculable harm. Still out of that historic council, which concluded 57 years ago, has emerged a group of Christians and Jews, religious leaders, scholars, activists, ordinary citizens, committed to mutual respect and understanding, to overcoming the sources of bigotry and discrimination in our own religious traditions, to making this world a saner and safer place for our children. We have come a long way, and we have a long way to go. May we follow this path together. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Judy, for that, both for the reminder of how difficult and how surprising and what a blessing finally came at that Vatican Council. And also for the sobering reminder that the virus of anti-Semitism has certainly not disappeared from Christian communities as well. I'd like to open this for questions, which could be offered to Judy and to Jesper. You can use the chat to ask a question, or you can ask it directly if you wave. Let's see. We have.
You go to the reactions button, you can see there a way to raise your hand, and that will bring your face to the attention of John.
Lauren?
Hi, actually, it's the same question I put in the chat to Dr. Svartvik. Maybe this is not that relevant, but you were talking so much about covenant and new covenant. Am I wrong that in Jeremiah actually mentioned, at least in the English, mentions new covenant? I'm not saying what that would mean, but I mean, that was my question. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, it's mentioned in Jeremiah, the 31st chapter, and it plays a role. I mean, this plays a very important role in Christian understanding of the relation between old and new and the two parts of the Christian Bible and Christian self-understanding. It's quoted, I believe, in the epistle to the Hebrews. What's interesting there is that Hebrew seems to rely on a version that's different from the Masoretic text. In the Masoretic text, it says that although they went astray, I remained Baalti. I was like a Baal. I was like a husband or a lord to them. But that is changed in the epistle to the Hebrews. So the verb there, I believe, is amelain, not to, and I didn't bother. I didn't care. So the starting point for the reflection in Hebrews is different from the Masoretic text. So that's one observation about Jeremiah 31. A second one is that for me it's clearly eschatological. It can't be something that is for a Christian. I mean, as a prophecy about the advent of Christianity, where it says certainly not the advent of the Reformed tradition, where it says no one shall teach the other one, because if something that the Reformed tradition is good at is that we have very long sermons. So I mean, it has to be understood as something that is yet to come. And the third aspect I'm thinking of when it comes to Jeremiah 31 is it says when we can measure heavens, when we can explore the underworld, when we understand everything, then I will reject the children of Israel or the offsprings of Israel. So therefore, it clearly it cannot be a statement that says that with the advent of Christendom, the old covenant ceases, but rather it's a future forward-oriented text. And who can explore the heavens? Who can explore the underworld? So that's how I see it. So thank you for raising that issue. I only had 20 minutes, so I had to choose carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
John, you're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted. A question from Mary Boyce for Judy. Mary writes, as a young woman, you encountered such ugly theological teachings in Catholicism, and then you witnessed similarly malevolent responses to some bishops at the Vatican Council. What was it that enabled you to persevere and to continue to contribute in so many powerful ways to so many over the years?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that. I think what happened was the first day I came to the AJC, and I was hired. I got there a year and a half before Mark Tanenbaum came, so I was hired by Rabbi Boris Kurtzer, and who is the father of David Kurtzer, who's been writing that stuff about Pius XII. And I met somebody in the hall who said, oh, you're the new person in Interreligious. I said, yes. He said, I hope you realize that a woman can't do this job. Of course, that was before women rabbis. And by the time there were women rabbis, I realized I didn't want to be one. I didn't feel I could give spiritual advice to other women. But look, it was an uphill trudge, but it was an interesting one. And we did have friends and support within the Roman Catholic community. You know, after the Second Vatican Council, there was Ed Flannery. First, there was Father Flannery, then there was Eugene Fisher. Eugene and I did a lot of worked together, including co-editing Rabbi Mark Tanenbaum's writings. And it wasn't banging my head against the wall continuously. There were gratifications, there was change. There was also backsliding, and there was a lot of enmity. But I guess I just went along out of stubbornness. I wanted to show that son of a gun that a woman could do the work. And then, of course, I had my secret army, the Sisters of Zion, and you, Mary.
Jael, I see your hand up.
Oh,
Yeah, and by the way, I got a question from Willie Weiss, who asked if that French scholar was Claire Huchet Bishop, and the answer is yes, it was Claire Huchet Bishop, and I did mention her name. She was a devotee of Jules Isaac, and she wanted to get his books published in the United States, and Mark Tanenbaum was helpful to her in getting them published. So we had a very close relationship with her, and she was my mentor in many ways.
Jael?
okay. I just have a question based on the beginning of our program today, that the ease with which we've gotten used to the trope, the old and the new, to describe the changes. In popular use, Christianity is seen as the new and Judaism as the old. And it seems to me that the changes in Judaism as a result of the end of the Second Temple period were so vast that Christianity and Judaism as we know it today are both the children of that time. And the Judaism has the longer direct passage with the Hebrew Bible community, but it doesn't seem to me that it's a useful trope anymore, that if we disregarded it, we might make greater progress.
Thank you.
John, would you like me to comment
Jesper,
on that?
Jesper, I think that was your part of the program.
Thank
Yep.
you. So thank you very much. I agree that we need to think in another way, and many people do, many scholars do, many preachers do, not thinking of Judaism that's only to be identified with the Hebrew Bible. And I mean, when I was a student studying at Lund University in the 1980s, they still talked about Spätjudentum and late Judaism, Senjudendom in Swedish, and that was something that belonged to the past. So they didn't really relate to modern contemporary Judaism. My first encounter with that was when I was granted a scholarship and went to Jerusalem, and I remember what an revolutionary experience it was. So the meeting vibrant Jewish spirituality today make Christians realize that one can't use those categories. So very often, of course, we would now talk about, as you say, contemporary Judaism, contemporary Christianity as both the offsprings of Second Temple Judaism in different ways, in very different ways, but that they cope with disasters in antiquity in different ways, like post-traumatic religious traditions with the fall of the temple, and Christianity wrote down the New Testament, and the rabbinic tradition wrote down the oral tradition, starting with the Mishnah and the Tosefta, and both are younger and both are older. So thank you. That's very helpful to not to talk about Judaism and Christianity as old and new. And I only did that because I wanted to be a thought-provokingly present the idea that the words are not used consistently in the New Testament. So thank you.
Thank you.
Randall, Zachman, to Judy, what did Nostra Aetate leave out that you would have hoped would be included, given that the final document was a compromise document?
Oh, well, for example, I mean, just some very subtle changes in the language. At the beginning of in one of the earlier drafts, it was anti-Semitism was condemned. In the final draft, it wasn't condemned, it was deplored. And also it was prefaced that that even though the Jewish leaders at the time, you know, demanded Jesus' death, etc., that can't be applied to the Jews of today. And that was also introduced. It wasn't in the earlier draft. But what happened was that the draft was supposed to have been just a draft on Jewish-Catholic relations. And it was broadened to include relations with other non-Christians, relations with Islam. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. Who could object to that? But it sort of distilled the focus on the Jewish Catholic agenda, if you understand. So it became chapter 4 of the document on ecumenism. Not a separate document, but included in, you know, and in some ways it was more, there was an apology. The church apologized to the Muslims for misunderstandings or for, you know, perhaps, I don't remember the exact language, but you know, for maybe actions against Islam. But it didn't apologize to the Jews.
Also to Judy from Eric, does the church condemn the comments that you've mentioned that are being circulated in Iran and Arab and some Islamic countries?
You know, I don't know if there has been a reaction to what the Syrian Orthodox Archbishop said. You know, and I haven't had a chance to research that. But I mean, right now, that with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, I mean, I think the church has its hands full. And there's, you know, there's also a counter. There's an anti-Francis element within the church as well. So, I mean, he has to, in a certain sense, deal with that. Francis said at one point that he's not particularly interested in theology. He's mainly a pastoral pope. And so he's also, you know, made some bloopers as far as, you know, condemning the Pharisees and, oh dear, I can't, hold on, I'm getting another call. I can't talk now. So, but I think, you know, by gesture and by action, you know, the fact that John Paul II went to the Western Wall, that he put in a prayer, you know, of contrition about the harm that was done to Jews and Judaism, that he's referred to us as his old, you know, Jews are the older brothers of Christianity, that he attended the synagogue in Rome. And Francis, in a sense, did the same thing. He invited the chief rabbi to his ordination. So, not his ordination, his installation. So, I mean, that had since, the church has since described anti-Semitism as a sin against God and man. So, you know, that's movement in one direction, some backsliding in other directions, and as I say, it's a tradition that was so deeply embedded in Christian teaching and theology, that it's you can't dislodge it in 50 plus years, and of course the Jewish world is particularly sensitive to anything that sort of indicates that Jewish conversion to Christianity is the goal of the statement. And there was even a statement, I think, by I don't remember, it was by the Pope or by the head of the commission, that looked forward to the day when Jews and Christians will come, when Jews will join the church. So the question is that something that's seen as an immediate goal, or is that something that should be seen as the end of time? And that was clarified to the extent that the dialogue could continue.
I have a quick, what I hope is a quick question, but I wonder if there are moves to within the church, in your observation, or in interreligious dialogue, to address not just the particularities of these issues, but the larger question of religious pluralism and how it relates to the particularity and exclusivism in so much, especially of Christian language. That kind of question, it seems to me, is very challenging. But if that conversation is proceeding, where is it lodged?
Yeah, the conversation is proceeding. I gave a paper on some of the issues I've discussed here today at one of the Vatican Jewish it's called the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, with a terrible sounding acronym called ICHKIC, which sounds like a skin disease. But there were regular meetings between Vatican representatives and representatives of the Jewish community. And I was at one of those meetings and gave a paper at one of those meetings. But and I was also helpful in editing the final statement. Somebody said, we need more women at these meetings. I've never been invited to another one. So, so I don't know, but I think in retrospect, if we look 500 years from now, if we're still around, if our religious communities are still distinct, that it may have been the Religious Liberty Declaration, the acceptance, which implies the acceptance of a pluralism of religions. Before that, you could, before Vatican II, there were interreligious programs, but you couldn't get Catholic priests to stand on a podium with a Protestant or a Jew or anyone else, because it was like they would be admitting that these were also legitimate, religious representatives. And I used to say, if we wanted to have a dialogue, we'd have to ship in some Jesuits from Jersey. But that's different now. There are shared podiums and there are ongoing dialogues, not only between the church and the Jewish people, but the church and the Protestant community. And,
well, thank you, Judy. We're out of time for this first session, but appreciate your your input and Jesper's, and I think we're off to a good start.
Yeah, I just want to say, John, that your father's concept of holy envy has animated my life in the interreligious field. I owe him so much.
Yeah. One of the many wise things he said.
Yes.
It's a good
Yeah.
heritage.
Thank you.
So the second session is scheduled for 2:30, I believe.
2:50.
And so
2:50.
What time?
2:50, I meant. Sorry.
And if you would like to join a breakout room to have continued discussion on the substance of this session, you have received and should have received an invitation to do so. And you're more than welcome to do that, or to stay in the main room and have some conversation with other people. And otherwise, we will be back and reconvene in about 25 minutes.